I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. This summer, Madonna, the mega-famous singer, dancer, performer, actor, controversy magnet, celebrated her 65th birthday. 5 years ago, for her 60th, the Times put together a feature titled 60 Times Madonna Changed Our Culture. You should find it, and you should read it, because honestly, we probably could have come up with 100 ways. She has lived the fullest of lives, much of it in the public eye. So it feels appropriate to have an 800-something page biography of Madonna here on my desk. And this week, I speak to Mary Gabriel, author of the book, Madonna, A Rebel Life. Let's turn now to that conversation. I'm here with Mary Gabriel, author of the Pulitzer Prize finalist Love and Capital, Karl and Jenny Marx and the Birth of a Revolution, 2018's 9th Street Women, Lee Krasner, Ellen de Kooning, Grace Hartigan, Joan Mitchell, and Helen Frankenthaler, 5 painters in the movement that changed modern art. And she's here to talk about her new book, Madonna, A Rebel Life. Mary, welcome to the Book Review Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Mary, the subtitle for 9th Street Women is quite a mouthful. I'm so glad you chose a short one for your new book.
I chose a short subtitle, but I wrote a very long book.
You sure did, and I have questions about that. But let's start broad, big picture. So for a very long time, Madonna was one of the most famous people in the world, certainly for multiple generations. I'm in my 40s, so let's say me and maybe people slightly younger, and certainly for everyone older. She was omnipresent. Why was this the book that you needed to write now following 9th Street Women?
It's a very neat timeline if you think about it, because that book ended in 1959 and Madonna was born in 1958. And when I started this, that wasn't the reason I did it. I wanted to keep writing about women artists because I felt like there was a sequel there. But if I didn't want to write about visual artists because I knew I would repeat myself. So I started looking around at different possibilities. And while I was doing that, Madonna gave her 2016 Billboard Women in Music Awards speech, which was so unbelievable. It was just after the Trump victory. It was a moment of extreme reflection for women in the country after having been repudiated on a mass scale. But her speech was kind of a wake-up call or a bell ringing in my head saying, this is the person. She's an artist. She's navigating this she has navigated this supposedly 60s, 70s, and 80s era of women's liberation and freedom of expression and equality. And yet, was it really that? After 9th Street, those women had gone through the 50s and the 40s of really a dire situation for women socially. This new era was supposed to usher in something new. But Madonna's speech described how that didn't happen and how that affected her. And so I thought she's the perfect guide into this new era, and she's an artist. So it allowed me to continue that story from a different perspective, music, and also she's a visual artist, but we can get into that later. I like to, in my books, guide people through historical periods. I kind of use characters as avatars. We learn about history through the experiences they've had. So Madonna was the perfect character for that reason.
Biographies of living subjects are particularly thorny to do. Did you have any hesitations going into this project?
I was so naive. I've been lurking in the 19th century and the mid-20th century for so long. I thought, wow, how great to have an opportunity to actually speak to people. And so I made a long wish list of people to interview, Madonna foremost among them. And I just had no idea how closed a certain level of celebrity, how closed the world of a certain level of celebrity is, and how difficult, if not impossible, that was going to be. And so some people were really generous and wonderful and took time and spoke with me. I never got through to Madonna, and a lot of the people who were closest to her, I wasn't able to speak to. But rather than give up, I just treated her the way I did my historical figures in previous books. And I went back to the hundreds of interviews she's given, both taped and written or in print. I read the thousands of articles about her. And I set her in her time by doing a massive research on women's history, LGBTQ history, racism in America, the arts, the music scene. So anyway, I actually ended up constructing the book the way I did my other books about long dead historical figures, even though she's with us today.
Do you think the book would have been different if you had had direct access to Madonna, which maybe was never going to happen, or maybe direct access to more of the people in her orbit?
Yes and no. It would have been wonderful. I can't say that. A firsthand interview is always great. You'll learn things that haven't been said before. Remarkably, even after 40 years, there's still things to say. But one of the things that I think I was able to do by doing it the way I did was I like to allow readers to hear voices from different eras so that you get the sense of growing up with the characters. So let's say if I include quotes from a Madonna interview from 1982 or 1983, that's so much more valuable than if I asked Madonna today, well, what was it like in New York in the early days? She would remember and it would be valuable. But the immediacy of what she said at the time and the way she said it also, how her language and her openness and her availability changed through the years. I think that's really valuable for readers. So I would have loved to have spoken to her. I would have loved to have spoken to Rosie O'Donnell, some of the people Debbie Mazar, the people who've known her forever. But luckily for me, luckily for readers, and luckily for all of us, they've spoken to other journalists through the years. So I was able to gather up during 5 years of research enough information, I think, to do justice to the story.
I think also, speaking as someone who has been a culture journalist for quite a while, there also comes a point in which, try as they might, people that have been interviewed as many times as Madonna just say the same stories over and over again.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I can imagine why it happens. And I can imagine why people in her circle use almost the same language time after time after time. One of the fun things in doing this project was finding really obscure interviews where people did open up more. And I would find that nugget and think, oh, great. Having read 15 other interviews from that particular album's release, I know that this is new. So you're absolutely right, though. And we all do it, where our memories become telescoped and we just remember a few words and a few images. And sometimes they didn't even actually happen.
Mm-hmm. This task in particular of organizing the life of someone who has lived so publicly for so long, I imagine has its pluses and minuses. On the one hand, you have your work cut out for you because there's all this material out there, just an overwhelming amount of interviews, video clips, all that stuff. On the other hand, how do you make your way through all that stuff to bring fresh insights to it as a biographer?
I think the thing that really excites me about writing about people, about writing biographies, is making connections. So you've got a quote or you've got people writing about the release of her American Life album, let's say, and, you've got countless Madonna interviews. You've got people writing about it from every side, the political spectrum. And then what I like to do is fill in the blanks, the background noise. What was going on at the time? What was happening to other artists? And I think that once you take all of those quotes and all of the information that we've already heard and put it in context, I think a whole new universe opens up. And for example, with Madonna's story, one of the things I think that's been the most neglected is in the retelling of her birth story, her artistic birth story. It starts in Michigan. She goes to New York. But what was actually happening in New York at that time? There were two revolutions underway. One was cultural, which was this unbelievable rebirth of art in Lower Manhattan, across the arts, in film, music, painting, rap. It was unbelievable what was going on there. And there was a social revolution that was happening in the clubs, where in Reagan's America, every kind of person communed, had this beautiful group moment where they could be protected from an outside world that disliked them and intensely in some cases. Women, gays, lesbians, black, white, brown, rich, poor, everybody was there together, moving as one. And it was this wonderful tribal communal thing. And I think when you understand that, the radical art world she came from and the social revolution she was part of in the early clubs, I think everything she does after that makes sense. And you look at it in a different way. Because pop artists, I actually believed this until I started studying Madonna, that pop artists weren't created by the artists themselves, that there is somehow a market phenomenon, that a group of men get together and decide we're going to create, I'll use Madonna, but we could say any number of female artists. And that person is going to dominate the charts for a certain amount of time. And then they'll be replaced by the next one to keep the market going. But with Madonna, she was completely self-generated, self-created. And in fact, so much so that when she first tried to sell herself, the powers that be at record companies and in the industry didn't know what to make of her. They were repelled by her. So I think that once you readjust your vision of where she came from, I think that who she became is much more interesting. So that's what I've tried to do.
For those listeners who haven't read the book yet and don't remember the life arc of Madonna, you have this young Italian girl from a Catholic family, grows up in Michigan, starts dancing, moves to New York, finds herself in that period in New York that everyone who is nostalgic about the New York they never lived in seems to talk about all the time, late 70s and early 80s, which is when you had this confluence of rap, new wave, punk, CBGBs, Danceteria, the Roxy, these clubs that you were talking about, artists like people that Madonna became friends with, Keith Haring, Basquiat, an older Andy Warhol, fashion. She really was in the middle of all these worlds. This book is 800 pages, so it's quite detailed, but you write with great interest and understanding about that world. And I thought, well, she just wrote a large book about female artists. This is the part that pulled her out of that book into Madonna's world, these crossovers with all these amazing visual artists. And then, she becomes one of the most famous people in America and then one of the most famous people in the world through the 80s and 90s, partly because of her music, but partly because she was very good at courting controversy. And I have a couple questions about that later. But I was wondering if you could go a little deeper on the time. In a piece you wrote for the New York Times' opinion section in August, which is when Madonna turned 65, you wrote, "The timing of Madonna's arrival was critical to her impact." Can you sketch out a little more what the cross currents were of the moment? You talked a little bit about the New York scene, but there is also politically in America a lot going on as well.
Yeah. So let's say Madonna's her first single was released in 1982. Ronald Reagan had just been elected. The religious right in the United States was in the ascendancy, and it's hard for us to imagine today. But after World War II, Democratic politicians had actually dominated the country. And so through the whole 1960s and up to Richard Nixon in the 70s, there was this push toward, I guess you could call it a liberal push. There was voting rights, civil rights, women's rights. After Stonewall on 69, gay rights. And so that's the scene that the lower Manhattan of the late 70s and early 80s arose out of. And that's the world that Madonna entered. But outside of that world, it was highly conservative. The kind of runaway, or what I call scavenger capitalism, that turned New York City into what we know today. The gentrification of New York had begun. So all of these artists in Lower Manhattan were being forced out. And so this group of people, Madonna among them, were a group under siege. And their artistic language developed in this really warm and wonderful cocoon, a protected cocoon, but that was ending. They were literally being decimated by what I call two viruses. One involved real estate, that literally the places where they lived and worked were being purchased out from under them. The other was AIDS, because in 1981, this very mysterious disease started hitting the community, and no one really knew what it was, except that it was killing people by the thousands. And you could see the death on the street. You could see young men who you knew just months earlier as healthy and vibrant, suddenly being covered with scars or sores. And not much longer after that, they were dead. And so it was a kind of an apocalyptic moment, if you can think of it that way, for these artists. What they had was the warmth of a community, and that community was being destroyed from without and from within. And so Madonna arose out of that in 82, 83, and up to 85, when she really became well known with Desperately Seeking Susan. She took that scene that was under threat she encapsulated it in her work and in her person, and she introduced it to the world. And that was just the first time that she did that. And she did that repeatedly. You call it courting controversy, but it's really just that she takes underground art forms, underground movements, underground philosophies and ways of living, and she introduces them to the world and says, you have to look at this. And so in my understanding of, or in my suggestion that the timing of Madonna is critical, I think that that's what I was getting at.
Practically, what was it like to shift from writing a group portrait of 5 female artists to writing, again, just a richly detailed look at this single person who, again, is someone that most people have heard of, at least?
It was very difficult. It's actually easier to write about 5 people, because if there's a lull in someone's life, you can always find the person who's doing something interesting. There are people who a reader is going to fall in love with, and readers are going to think of as a villain. And so it's much easier actually to do a group. One person is very difficult to sustain interest in. But I have to tell you, I was waiting, praying for a lull in Madonna's life, because it is exhausting, and it never happened. At any given moment, she's writing music, making a video, working with a charity, running a record company, has children, is married, is divorced. She never stops. And her single day from start to finish is what a normal person would probably accomplish in a month. So I didn't have the luxury of having any downtime with Madonna's life, but it was quite difficult in comparison to the 5 women.
There don't seem to be any lulls in Madonna's life. She's gone through so many different phases. We just talked a little bit about her young years in the late 70s and early 80s. She becomes a real star in the mid-80s when she's in the film Desperately Seeking Susan, and she starts to release her first few albums. Can you give us, again, for the benefit of our listeners who need their memory jogged, just a brief sketch of how the rest of her 80s and particularly her 90s go? Not much happened, so you should be able to do this in
that's right.
90 seconds.
When Madonna left New York, this situation we were talking about, this kind of imploding situation in New York, she moved to Los Angeles, which was such a difficult transition. She went from a place where life was real and raw and immediate to a place where it was all fantasy. And so really wonderfully, she and the director, Mary Lambert, came up with the idea of her introducing this new Madonna, this new Los Angeles Madonna, in the Material Girl video, where she channels Marilyn Monroe and all the glitter that is Hollywood. And so in each of her manifestations, I think she's really affected by where she lives, and that person is the persona she inhabits. So she left New York, she moved to California, and she became this Marilyn Monroe figure. And she married Sean Penn, and they were right out of the 50s. He was this kind of rough and tumble bad boy, young actor. She was this utterly glamorous, gorgeous young woman. People couldn't stop talking about them or writing about them. But as she matured through her work and through her, just as a woman, and as her marriage started disintegrating, her work became so much more focused and so much more important, and the statements she made were so much more important. By the end of the 80s, she did her album Like a Prayer, which was a real step into being an artist, to my mind. Visually, and her album and her singles were so fantastic. And after that, she made her biggest gay statements, which were her initial ones, which were Blonde Ambition, Vogue, and then into the 90s with her sex book and Justify My Love. So her evolution, she went from this very kind of fun-loving look at Hollywood. She lived that Hollywood experience, which involved a close-up view of the misogyny of the industry, which still only saw women as figures to be manipulated, but not to be respected. And certainly not one that belonged behind a camera. She went from that and seeing also the homophobia of Hollywood, where all of her friends who were gay had to stay in the closet, especially her actor friends. And she, as her own immediate friends were dying of AIDS, her best friend Martin Burgoyne, Keith Haring, Herb Ritz would die, her photographer who followed her and made her who she was in the 80s visually. She then came out and made her greatest statements about gays and lesbians and gay rights and trans rights. And so with that, she moved to Miami, which is so wonderful because that was the one place, like New York City and Lower Manhattan in the 80s, Miami Beach, South Beach in the early 90s was where you could actually be yourself if you weren't a white heterosexual conservative. You could do anything you want and then some. And so it's no surprise that coming out of that experience, Madonna produced Sex, Justify My Love, Erotica.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz, and I'm here with Mary Gabriel. We're talking about her book, Madonna, A Rebel Life. Mary, look, this podcast, I feel like, could be hours long because there's so many things to talk about when it comes to Madonna, who's lived an incredible and full life. You just gave us a brief sketch of her life and professional career up to the early 90s. I'm curious, when did you first experience Madonna as a consumer, as a listener? What was your introduction to her?
I really was never a Madonna fan.
This is exactly what I wanted to hear.
Oh, good. I was a journalist for 20 years, and I worked with women who had been in war zones and really hardcore journalists who liked Madonna. And I remember being at parties where they had to leave early because they were going to a concert and they were dressed up in Madonna gear. And I didn't get it at all, but I thought, okay, I respect them, so there must be something there. It really is not until I started writing, when I came upon that speech and started thinking of her as a subject, did I start listening to her and learning about her. And so I'm actually introducing the reader to the Madonna I discovered. And I think in a way, I hope in a way, it's helpful that I wasn't a fan, because I try not to get caught up in the daily controversies involving her life. Did she, didn't she, should she, shouldn't she have, and just look at her as a big picture historical figure and artist. But I can tell you now, at the end of this journey, I'm an absolute diehard Madonna fan because I have such enormous respect for not only what she created, but for the adversity that she seems to be able to this day, ignore, and for how much she's inspired and changed the world. And very few artists can say that.
I grew up with Madonna. I think Madonna was breaking literally right as I was born, so I cannot remember a world without her. But as someone who came late to her, I'm curious. This is a question I'm sure you'll be asked elsewhere. Do you like different Madonna albums and songs than everyone else who just grew up listening to Borderline, Material Girl, Crazy for You?
When I started this project, I started listening to her music chronologically. And when I listened to the Madonna album, I thought, oh, wow, this is really great. And I listened to Like a Virgin. I thought, oh, this is really great. And I feared that they were going to get worse after that. But then they just kept getting better. I love them all. And I do still listen. And I forced my husband to listen to Madonna for 5 years straight in the kitchen.
I talked briefly before about this dynamic. I use this phrase, courting controversy. But one of the ways that you reframe it is that she over and over does things that other people assume will end her career and don't, and that she does this because she is artistically compelled to do so. So you go from her, at the time, controversial performance of Like a Virgin on the first MTV Video Music Awards, her, as you talked about, her, how outspoken she was on the HIV/AIDS crisis, her video for Like a Prayer, which included Catholic imagery, cross-burning imagery, Sex, the book of erotic photography that she released, and we can keep going on this. What do you think it is about her that finds her continuing to be in these situations?
I think it's because, one, even though she's been accused throughout her career of being fame hungry, I think she really doesn't care about fame. And in fact, she pokes the bear a bit. What's most important to her is a message that she wants to convey, not how it's going to be received. But the other thing is that she trusts that the people she's speaking to are going to get it, that she'll be able to cut through all of the hysterias that whatever she does evokes. She'll be able to cut through that and actually get to the people she needs to reach. The other part is that she's always been political. She's political to the core. And I think it's partly, I try to describe it when I'm talking about her childhood. Her generation and my generation, and maybe yours, we grew up at a time when there was so much social unrest. Kids today will have it too. There were assassinations, there were riots, it was continual. There was nothing that you could depend on and really nothing you could believe. There was so much mixed messaging. And she emerged from that, having lived in Detroit, in Pontiac, which is just outside of Detroit, and then moved to a really white community in a white flight when her family left the burning rubble of what was Detroit. She never lost those lessons. And I think she remained political forever. And so in her work, she wants to do several things. She wants to entertain. She wants to seduce as in delight. She wants to communicate messages. And those messages are sometimes about love, sometimes about fun, sometimes they're mischievous. But really, I would say 70% of the time there's a political message in there. She doesn't hit you over the head with it, not until about 2003 when she did American Life. But she does it in the way that pop culture does best, which is tricks you into seeing life in a different way. Oftentimes, we don't think of pop culture, or maybe we do, but I didn't think of pop culture as kind of the engine that drives society, rather than society driving pop culture. You have a TV show like The Cosby Show, whatever happened after that. Let's just forget about that for the moment. But that show really changed race relations. You have Modern Family, which I think really helped change how middle America viewed gay families. And Madonna did that repeatedly with her music. And so her first outreach was to young women who were stuck in their suburban homes everywhere, thinking, I'm told I'm equal to my brothers, but I know I'm not because there's just not the opportunities that they have. And she said, take a look at me. You can do it. And all of her songs and all of her music delivered that message. And then the next message in the late 80s was to the gay and lesbian community. Have no fear. Have no fear. I'm going to speak for you. We're going to have fun together. And the other thing she did was at that moment when gays were mentioned in the media or in culture, it was associated with death. It was all about AIDS. And she said, no, these are my friends. These are the people I love. Look at them. They're all beautiful. They're all alive. They're all valuable. They all have something to say. And so this is what throughout her career, she's courted controversy, as you say, because what she has to say is more important than the comfort of her career.
The early years and the early successful years of any major artist are always fascinating. How would you characterize the latter part of Madonna's career, which is still going? I feel like there came a certain point, maybe it was around the time of that album you mentioned or after that, when she had been omnipresent for so long that newer generations stopped paying attention to her, or maybe she didn't feel as top of mind as she used to be.
Well, I don't agree with that, but I'll tell you what I think. A lot of things changed, but let's get her to 2000. She just had Ray of Light, which was her most critically heralded album was 1997, I think it was. So she was really at the top of her game. Everybody loved that Madonna. Everybody loved the Earth Mother Madonna, who had just given birth and was singing about nothing at all controversial. And then she moved to England. And from that moment on, she began working with European producers mainly and outside of the United States. So her hold on the U.S. market slipped a little bit because of that. There was also the rise of this whole sugar pop thing. These young women who were her artistic daughters, Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera and those people. So they were a marketer's dream. They were what Madonna didn't turn into. When she first appeared on the scene, and especially after Material Girl, you can imagine the executives in the music industry and in Hollywood thinking, oh, thank God, a woman can be beautiful and sexy and wild again. We can go crazy with this. But that's not who she was. She wasn't singing to a heterosexual audience, and she wasn't trying to seduce that crowd. So with the whole Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera thing, they answered that need in the industry. And so Madonna was sidelined a bit. And then the record industry itself was changing. Technology was changing. And radio stations were changing. Conglomerates took over. And you didn't have these wonderful kind of boutique DJs who listeners trusted. And if they played something, the listener would go out and buy the record. That didn't exist anymore. It was Clear Channel, who owned 300,000 radio stations across the country and played the same 16 songs every day. So I think it wasn't so much that Madonna was less powerful as an artist. I think it was that the times had changed around her, and she had moved on as well. But her album, American Life, was very provocative, and it was bad timing because of the Iraq War, and she came out against it when that wasn't something you should do. But she came back in 2005 with an album called Confessions on a Dance Floor, which brought Madonna back to her roots. It was this really explosive, magnificent album that she came shooting out of a cannon after a terrible riding injury that should have disabled her, should have prevented her from dancing. A really rocky period in her second marriage. And she did this album that was so joyous and reminded people so much of who she was that she was back on top and heralded. Now, I won't go through the rest of it because it would be too long, but now I fear that she's being ignored if you just look at record sales alone because of her age, obviously, because of the way she's written about, which is as if she's passé. And yet her music is so fantastic.
The two biggest touring musical artists of the moment are Taylor Swift and Beyonce, who've had these sort of box office breaking, culturally titanic tours this year, the Eras Tour and the Renaissance World Tour. Is there a line to be drawn in terms of influence acknowledged by those artists or not? Is there a line to be drawn from Madonna to people like that in terms of presentation, in terms of scope of ambition?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Madonna was the first solo female artist to have an arena tour. When she started, Warner Brothers, her record company, didn't know if she would be able to fill any audiences. They didn't think that because she was a woman, she would be able to do that. She wasn't a Prince. She wasn't a Michael Jackson. She wasn't U2. And she proved them wrong from the very start. And so she was the trendsetter as far as that goes, that a woman actually could have a hall filled with 70,000 people. And she could actually sell out shows because it didn't exist before Madonna. Secondly, she is actually the architect of these shows you see today. I read recently about the acts in Beyonce's tour that's broken down to acts. Before Madonna's Blonde Ambition tour, that didn't exist for a pop singer or a pop culture figure. That concert, and I hope that one of the things I really hope when people read this book is that they actually take the time to go and look at this stuff on the internet, because Blonde Ambition is there. And that concert, I don't know when the last time you saw that or if you ever saw it, but it's so great. It's so warm and wonderful and wild and exhilarating. And that was the first time that a female artist literally occupied a stage of that size globally with that size of a production. And now we take it for granted. The Beyonce and Taylor Swift tours are exactly where Madonna's Blonde Ambition went. And in fact, when I see Taylor Swift in her little sparkly outfits, and that's Madonna in her second tour, that's how she looked in her Who's That Girl tour. She wore a little spangled, not a corset, but a kind of like a acrobatic dancer's outfit. And that's Taylor Swift's doing that today. But of course, this always happens historically. Each generation forgets about what happened before. But I'm sure those two young women know where they came from.
As our pop music editor, Karen Gans, wrote also on the occasion of Madonna's 60th birthday, she said, quote, "One of the great conundrums of the internet era is pop culture's short memory." The idea that hypothetically, we should be able to watch all this stuff. It's all out there on the internet, on YouTube. And yet, as you rightly point out, we do forget about our pop culture titans, even when they're still around. I have a couple more questions. The footnotes for this book are not in the book. That what would have made the book like 1,000 pages? Like, how long would the book, there's just so many sources that you go to.
Yeah. And it really kills me to do that because I think if I hadn't been a writer, I would have been a librarian. I just love that part of the writing process, the research. And I also love documenting it because there's nothing to me more frustrating than looking at a book, trying to find the source of a quote and not being at all clear where it came from. So I think the bibliography and notes, I don't know. I haven't looked at the link, but I think there are a couple hundred pages, maybe like 300. So you can imagine, I'm actually shocked that the book isn't as big as I feared it was going to be, but it's pretty damn big. So
last question, Mary, what do you think people's biggest misconceptions about Madonna are, and how does your book complicate those?
Well, I'm sure that she's a fame hound, that she's in it for the money, that she's out to shock without thinking about it, that she's competing with this younger generation, and that she's struggling for relevance. That's one of my favorites. Since when does an artist struggle for relevance? They struggle to create because that's what they have to do. That's who they are. And whether somebody looks at your painting or doesn't look at your painting, you're going to do it anyway. And I think in her case, we'd be surprised how much she's created that we don't know about, to the hours of studio recordings, the hours of video and film material and photographs that we've never seen. So I think it's this sort of dismissal of her as somebody who's in it for the fame, in it for the money, and in it because she's something other than an artist. I hope that will be dispelled in reading this, because I can't imagine that anyone who wanted just those things couldn't find an easier way to get them than having lived the life she did.
Mary Gabriel, thank you so much for coming on the Book Review Podcast to talk about your new book, Madonna, A Rebel Life.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was my conversation with Mary Gabriel, author of the new biography, Madonna, A Rebel Life. And if the very next thing you're doing after listening to this episode is not putting on your favorite Madonna songs, why not? I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.